My name is Tobin, and I am a true crime author of 14 books, soon to be 17. I don't know what I was thinking. This time last year, I signed 3 contracts with 2 different publishers to write 3 books. And the nice thing about that is I go with traditional publishing, and I'm assured that my stuff will see print, which is nice. And because I have a bit of a track record, they'll give me a contract without really having written anything. So the downside is once I sign on the line that is dotted, I have to produce. So the first one, which I did earlier in the year, was an old Detroit case, really old, going way back. And if you're into genealogy or research, you'll appreciate it. You'll appreciate this. One of the central figures in the case was a 10-year-old girl by the name of Mary Brown. Imagine trying to find a Mary Brown in a metropolis like Detroit. It's kind of like finding a needle in the haystack. The second book, which is going to be the first of the 3 that's going to be out, is called Killer Women of Michigan. And none of you ladies are in that one, but you could be in the sequel, right? The third one, which I'm in a mad dash to finish right now, is about a Black Widow-style serial killer who used the men in her life as kind of like a piggy bank, you know, a la life insurance policies. And then when she needed some money, they happened to die. Very interesting, kind of a strange case. Shotgun homicide, which is a strange, well, you'll see what I mean by that in a bit. Now, before I go into this particular topic, I notice there's some gentlemen in the crowd. Hi, guys. How you doing? Okay, you're here at your own risk. All right. I'm going to talk about poisons today. And the audience members, the ladies in my audience usually ask some pretty provocative questions, sometimes even take notes. Tell you an interesting story. I give presentations all over the state quite a bit. And I was giving one not too far from here, and an older lady had come with a gentleman who I think was her husband. And in the middle of the presentation, smaller group than this, she raised her hand. It's the cutest thing. She said, "So what you're saying is I can mix arsenic in his coffee to mask the bitter taste." And his eyes got like deer in headlights. And he kind of looked at her like this. And I thought to myself, oh man, what's going to happen if she poisons this guy? I'll be responsible. It's all that Catholic guilt. So I thought that if I'm going to give this presentation, I ought to start with that caveat that you guys are here at your own risk, okay? Management is not responsible if you don't look at that cup of coffee the same way that you did before, or worse. All right, here we go. So I'm going to introduce you to some really, really, let's say, pretty sinister characters throughout the history of Michigan. And how I got started with this was this document right here. What you're looking at is you're looking at a census record for the Detroit House of Correction. The old one, not the new one. And this is the female division. Now the old Hoco, kind of an interesting structure. Now I'll take you into it in a little bit. But it was the prison housed 3 distinct populations. One was federal prisoners from the territories. There's a mention of it in True Grit, both versions. The second population was males serving short time sentences from Wayne County in the city of Detroit. And the third was the women's division, which was short timers from Wayne County in the city of Detroit, as well as all of the long time inmates for the entire state of Michigan. And what's interesting about this is just within the Detroit House of Corrections, if you just compare the male and the female populations, which isn't comparing apples, it's kind of comparing apples to oranges, because the male population was all short timers. The long timers were in Jackson or Marquette at the time. So when you think about it, this list here is really, really short. There's not a lot of them, and this is it. This is all inclusive. So when the census takers came in 1910, and these are the women who were in the prison long enough to call it home, at least during that period of time. Most of these women are doing short sentences for drunken disorderly, a lot of drunken disorderly. One of them was in her 189th stint of drunken disorderly. Whiskey got her in a lot of trouble, right? Now, amongst these, though, you see 5 lifers. And that number's about right at any given time, any given year. The old Detroit House of Corrections had about 5 lifers. Not that many. So if I do have a laser pointer. So from top to bottom, we have Sarah Quimby, She is a lifer. Nellie Pope, that's 2. Jenny Flood, that's 3. Mabel Larson, actual name was Corin, that's 4. And then Mary McKnight, that's 5. So in the entire state of Michigan in 1910, there was just 5 females doing the full Monty, the whole enchilada. Now, this is the one that I was looking for right here, and here's how I got started with this entire subject. Mary Murphy McKnight, AKA the Michigan Borgia. And if she did half of what was assumed to have been her work, that would give the real Lucretia Borgia a bad name, I think. All right. Mary McKnight is, in some people's estimates, one of the worst female serial killers who ever lived. I don't know about that, but she's the most prolific one in the state of Michigan that I've researched. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Mary in a bit, but when I was researching her, I was looking for her line, and what you have here is she's female, this is her race, her age, marital status, widowed, and then she was from Canada. And then I started looking at her story, and I thought, it's kind of a fascinating story that she has. And I wondered what these other stories were too. And I started to pull up rocks to see what I could find underneath there. And what I uncovered was some of the wickedest, weirdest, darkest, most sinister females in Michigan history, and I will introduce those to you tonight. All right, so I like to walk around a bit when I talk, helps me think when I'm on my feet. So I've noticed that literally nobody wants to sit in the front row. I'm wondering, perhaps, they do say 1 out of every 20 people is a sociopath, right? The FBI says, so that would be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1 here. You guys are afraid I'm the sociopath in the crowd, aren't you? So nobody wants to be in the front row. When I write a book about history, I have to remind myself that the history that I'm writing about isn't exactly the same way things are today. In fact, things were infinitely different back then, particularly for females. So I'm going to take you, before I get into some of the characters, I'm going to take you on a brief history of yesteryear law and order. Now, one of the most startling changes is that sometimes what is a crime today wasn't a crime back then, I'm saying 100 years ago, and sometimes the reverse is true. So let me give you an example. You've heard the expression rule of thumb before, okay, as an unwritten guideline. Anybody know where it comes from? Rule of thumb, one of the possible, most likely origins of the expression is, as in the 19th century in Michigan and elsewhere, a husband had the legal right to beat his wife, as long as the stick he used was no thicker in circumference than his thumbs. You let that sink in for a minute. Okay, you can really wallop somebody pretty hard. I have small hands, don't judge me. All right, but I mean, even a stick that size. Okay, now today we would call that, what we call that, spousal abuse. We have a whole category for it. We would call this attempted murder, perhaps murder, if somebody loses his temper and hits too hard. Back then in the 19th century, that was considered not a crime at all. Fair game. Okay? Now keep that in mind for a minute, because we're going to come back to that in a minute. Now, so what was not a crime then is a crime today. This poster is the opposite. This fellow here, this mustachioed fellow, who's wanted by the Highland Park Police Department because he committed what was a crime in 1919 that wouldn't really be a crime today, and that is spousal abandonment. Now the reason, I think it's still on the statute books in a lot of jurisdictions, but no one ever prosecutes it anymore because we have more or less what is known as gender equity, right? So a female can, in theory, get any job that is available. But in 1919, when Willard walked away from his wife Irene, that wasn't the case, especially for an older woman like that. She had very, very limited job prospects, and she depended on Willard for her survival. Now, this is a really fascinating story. Allow me to digress here. I saw a documentary recently about Henry Ford. The Senator Henry Ford was having a heck of a time keeping his employees because work on the assembly line was very laborious. So he came up with a light bulb moment. How could he keep his workers? And that was to pay them more than everybody else. And so the $5 a day wage for an 8-hour workday was born. Well, people came from all over the place because this was a really good deal. So, including Willard and Irene Guy. In the mid-50s, they were in their mid-50s, they were from Kentucky. He was a machinist, and he wound up working for Ford's Motor Company's Highland Park plant, which was the largest automotive factory in the world at the time. So he's very typical of what happened with Detroit. All these people flooded into the city, and it became a million-person metropolis in around 1920. This is just before that. Now, the reason why Willard got his face on his mugshot on a wanted poster is because he walked away from his wife, Irene, and left her high and dry. There's a really interesting line that gives us a clue. It says, "He may be found with some woman who is not his wife." Aha! Willard had what my grandmother called a zipper problem. And you know what? They caught him. And they dragged him kicking and streaming back to, I like to think she popped him in the eye, give him a black eye, and then she gave him a steak for it like they did in the old days. And I would say they lived happily ever after. I don't know how happily it was for him, but they lived together for the rest of their lives. They died 1 month apart in 1926. Not much after this happened. Now, the card on the right-hand side is a very, very interesting photograph. And I began my presentation with a list of women, only 5 of whom were lifers. So in that year of 1910, there were only 5 women in the entire state of Michigan who were doing life sentence with the possibility of parole. One of the reasons why this is a comparatively slimmer list than the male population is because of what you're seeing here. And if you count them out, I bet you'll be able to figure out what this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And they're even numbered at the bottom. So you have yourself 12 angry men. And they have some really, really spectacular facial hair, don't they? Look at that guy's hair right there. Well, it's funny, isn't it? How things revolve, right? History tends to repeat itself. We're almost going through like a facial hair renaissance, in a way, with some elements of the population. You see this. I see this every now and again. Here's another one. Who don't you see in this photograph? You don't see a woman. The reason for that is this was 1888 when this photograph was taken. Women were not allowed to sit on juries, in Michigan at least, until suffrage, which was 1920. The first female juror in the state of Michigan was in 1925 in Wayne County, but by the late 1920s, juries regularly had a female participant, except for murder trials. Right? Now, the reason for that is because the court did not want to take a woman out of her assumed domestic responsibilities for the protracted period of time of a murder trial. Would it be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what have you. So even in the late 1920s, when you could have a mixed jury, for the bigger cases, the murder cases, it was still a man's only world, boys' club, if you will. There's a really interesting case involving a doctor who supposedly murdered his wife, but created the perfect crime, 1927 Detroit. One day I'll do some more writing about this particular case, I think. Although maybe I'm the only guy that finds it interesting. But one of the fascinating parts of it is the jury was all male. And this is 1927, and it didn't need to be, but it was. So how does this lead to fewer female incarcerees in the state of Michigan? Because you might be thinking that in a world where a guy can wallop his spouse with a stick, 12 guys would be really, really prejudicial against a woman defendant. But it was actually the opposite. It was said that the all-male juror was very open to suggestion. He was very open to manipulation by a female defendant. It was said that the all-male juror saw the female defendant that came in court in front of him and inevitably associated her with some woman in his life, be it his mother, his daughter, his sister, his aunt. And therefore, with a really good story, a real tearjerker, she might be able to get out of some really heavy sentences. And this is one of the reasons why that list to begin the presentation with is relatively slim. It's not the only reason why, but it's a really good one. Oops. Okay. Here you're looking at the Detroit Homicide Squad in 1910. Boy, have times changed. You have just, 6 of them? And then you have the matron. Her name is Clara Langerink. She would have played a very vital role when it came to female suspects. Now, with male suspects, what they did is they interrogated them right in the cells. You know, these old cells have hinged cots. They get hinged to the wall to move out of the way when they're not being used. They did these interrogations in a way that the public couldn't see them, because they would have a male suspect would walk in and he'd limp back out after he had a close encounter with a truncheon or a rubber hose, or, you know, they beat him, right? They didn't treat women this way. If a woman was interrogated, she would always have to be present, and it would be done in the police chief's office in full view of the public. And what that means then is that they allowed reporters to not just sit in on interrogations, but they allowed them to actually play a role in interrogations. And these reporters, they just absolutely reveled in this. Junior G-men status. They like to be right when the police were wrong. They like to catch suspects in obvious lies. And what they did is they printed whole transcripts of this. So when you research females, there's an added layer to the historical record that you would never get with the males, which is kind of interesting. Notice the camera, done for taking mug shots. It'll hold your pose for a while. And what they did with these mug shots is they printed them and they put them on a card. You can see the profile and the frontal. And then on the back of these cards would be basic information. And sometimes they duplicate these and send them to other jurisdictions. This was particularly true if there were con artists that were walking around, because their identities tended to change, their handwriting tended to change. The cabinets that hold these things are called the Rogues Gallery. Every major city in the United States had one. The largest one in the United States, if not the world, was in Chicago. The second was San Francisco. Detroit in 1910 isn't even a blip on the radar, because it wouldn't become the Motor City and it wouldn't have a 1 million person population in all the crime that went along with that for quite some time yet. Now at this point in time, I'd like to introduce you to Ismaniah Martin. Ismay, this will be a nice lighthearted story before I get to the really heavy stuff. Right? Ismay was a con artist extraordinaire. She was a teenager, late teens, 19 I think, and I think that she liked to weave these fantasy worlds for herself, and she could slip in and out of that fiction very easily. This is an ideal situation for a con artist. She come up with this idea for an MO. It's unique. I've never heard of any con artist using this before. Martin's a common last name. A lot of Martins in that Detroit city directory. So she go through the city directory one day, and so she comes across somebody who she knows will give her street credibility. She sees this name, John T. Martin, and she says, okay, this is the guy. She kind of adopts him. She goes to Grand Rapids, where I'm from, and she goes up to Heritage Hill, where all the painted ladies are, the Victorian mansions. And she tells him, everybody, she's the daughter of John T. Martin of Detroit. Oh, people know that name. It's a newsworthy name. That name is in the papers all the time. I know what John T. Martin does for a living, so she's got to be on the up and up. So people think nothing about giving her money for life insurance policies that don't exist and for bicycles that don't exist. Now, she would, if she was alive today, Ismay would be $1 million salesperson. But this avenue wasn't open to her, so she went into a different type of sales. She was so good at selling those bicycles, she actually started a craze. All the women in Grand Rapids wanted to have what they called their wheels, you know, those bicycles with a big front end on it. So they thought nothing about handing her greenbacks, but in fact, the wheels didn't exist. It was all in her mind. Now, Ismay had another talent besides selling, and that was having a sixth sense for knowing when the heat is around the corner. She got out of Dodge right before John T. Martin sent a squad up to Grand Rapids to get her, because he was the police chief of Detroit. And he didn't like being used this way. So he sent a squad up to get her. She had fled the jurisdiction. She set up in Cincinnati, where she went through the whole thing all over again. She went right back to the same gambit. She chose a different Martin, but this time she chose poorly, unwisely. She chose a Martin that was related to the people she was trying to defraud. They exchanged letters, and her goose was cooked. She got arrested in Cincinnati and taken to the photographer to sit for a mugshot. She didn't want to sit in that seat for that mugshot. He said that likening her to get her to sit still for that camera was kind of like trying to get a cat into a bathtub. You know, a cat doesn't want to get wet. Ismay doesn't want to be photographed. But he finally got her into the seat. And you know, you had to hold your pose for a while, right? So he says, hold your pose. This is what she did. Oops. That's not her. That's her. She made a clown face. She mugged for the mugshot. They didn't even do a profile view because it would have been unusable. Her mugshot went off to Library of Congress, where I found it. She went off to Grand Rapids for the Great Bicycle Trial of 1897. And she was found guilty and sentenced to 7.5 years at the Detroit House of Correction. Hard labor at the Detroit House of Correction, which is a very rough place. Her weight started to plummet immediately. Nicholson, who is the warden, thought she was going to die behind bars, so he pushed for an early release. She got out after a couple of years, and true to form, she went straight up to Mackinac Island. You know why? That's where all the rich tourists are. They caught her coming off the boat, and they put her right back on the boat. She was burned everywhere, so she decided to go straight, which was, she took a job with the Detroit Free Press, and instead of making the news, she reported on it. She never married. She never had kids. She died in the 1920s, and they wrote a kind of a glaring obituary of their writer, but they didn't mention her life as a con artist. Livonia Martin. This is Carrie Perlberg. Not such a funny character. Boy, I would not want to meet her in an alley. Carrie Perlberg had sticky fingers. She liked to steal stuff from high-line department stores like Carson Peary Scott in Chicago. She moved around like a lot of thieves and con artists do, and she got caught. And the reason why I like to show this particular mugshot is because when she got caught, she is an excellent example of how a woman can pull on the heartstrings of an all-male jury. When she got caught, she rented a baby for the trial. Think about that for a minute. She rented a baby for the trial, all right? The ultimate piece of visual rhetoric. Hold up the baby so the jurors can see that if they put her in prison, what will happen to the poor child, right? It worked the first time, didn't work the second time. And she went down for a fairly decently long sentence. Now, I'm going to talk about some really old cases, and I'm going to pause at this point in time. A lot of people wonder, what is the relevance of all this? And I would offer to you that there are patterns that repeat in crimes. This is how the FBI comes up with profiles. Patterns that repeat, repeat, repeat. Sometimes they repeat in some really eerie ways. I'm going to talk about cases from a long time ago, but you can hear echoes right into our present day. This is a really good example. She rented a baby for her trial because she knew she could pull on the heartstrings of an all-male jury. Livonia Martin once borrowed a baby from a friend to go talk a ticket agent out of a free ticket to Chicago using the exact same logic. I can't afford the ticket to Chicago. How will my poor baby and I get there? Wasn't even her baby, right? So yeah, it's the patterns tend to kind of revolve. Couple more mugshots before I get into the list. These are, this is Margaret Martin, no relation to Livonia Martin. The woman on the right-hand side is Evelyn Winifred. These are check kiters, and what that is a fancy word for is check forgers. In the day before security paper, their handwriting would vary, and their identities would change. They change personas. They're really fun to try to research, but very frustrating. This is the same woman, by the way. She got caught in San Francisco in 1914, and she got caught 1 year later in 1915 across the bay in Oakland. This time, her check kiting got her a sentence in San Quentin. So it was a fairly serious. By the way, these hats, there's all kinds of strange city ordinances. You look at like histories of bigger cities, sometimes they just never got rid of them. Do you know that it's a city ordinance in Detroit that you can't tie your pet alligator to a fire hydrant? You wonder where that comes from, right? You can see a funny kind of Keystone Cops moment where you know, the firemen come to open up a spigot and there's an alligator, snap, snap. You know, has to be something like that, right? Had to be. They have another funny ordinance. These hats were called Merry Widow's hats. There's a really interesting ordinance around these things. It was all the rage, 1900 to 1910, to get these things as big as you could possibly get them. I've seen them with stuffed parrots on them before. So big and cumbersome they got that they had to put a restriction on them because they were becoming an impediment to foot traffic. They restricted them to 8 feet in circumference. That's 8 feet in circumference. You can look it up. It's pretty wild, isn't it? Okay, so this is the only interior image I've ever seen of the old Detroit House of Corrections. The structure itself was very interesting. It was an Eastern Market area in the southern 4th Ward. And if you look at old maps of Detroit, you'll see a cemetery there. before the days in the earlier days of the city, they took people who had died of communicable diseases like typhus and smallpox, and they buried them outside of the city limits because there was a fear that you could get the disease from the bodies. Well, as the city got bigger and they needed to have a prison facility, they moved the cemetery. So if you look at early maps, the place where they put the prison was a cemetery. It existed until the mid-1920s, and they tore it down. And when they tore it down, they found some skeletons underneath it, which of course then immediately led to all kinds of rumors about how many people they kill. But in reality, I think they just didn't get all the skeletons out of the ground in the first place. This is the interior of the cell block. It had 2 cell blocks that radiated out like wings. Notice the 3 levels. Notice the elaborate grill work. The manufacturer of this was a Detroit iron firm. Get the name? E.T. Barnum. Isn't that funny? Not P.T. Barnum, but Edward Barnum. The reason why I think you don't see any interior images of a structure like this is because they couldn't capture motion real well. That's my guess anyways. I think all the inmates here must be doing the at-hard labor portion of their sentence, because anybody who was sentenced to Michigan to a long term, their sentence always read X number of years at hard labor, which meant they worked in one of the prison industries to defray the cost of their upkeep. So I think that that's the only way they would have gotten a picture of the deserted cell block, is if they were all working in the prison industries at this time. It's the only one I've ever seen. Go look into those trunks in your attic tonight and let me know if you see any, because I'd love to see them. They're just not there. Notice the high arch windows. All right, now this prison was built before the invention of the light bulb, so they built these windows to face the east so that the sun could come in and give some natural sunlight to the structure. Although, this is Michigan, so who are we kidding? There's what the exterior looked like. So we're standing east facing west. You can see the high arch windows again. A very, very majestic looking structure. This would have been the intake building here, and this would also be where the warden lived. You can see the high arch windows again in the back. I've only seen 3 images of the female population of this particular prison. This is one of them. This is taken in 1899. I wish I had a better image of it, a sharper one, because I tried to identify them. Notice the dresses they're wearing, right down to the floor, which would have been common at that time. Notice the matron. Her name is Mrs. Nellie Barnard. She was known as being a really tall woman. Notice she's wearing black. The woman behind her, I think the only taller woman in the prison than Nellie Barnard, was a woman named Nellie Pope, who was a serial killer. She was a murderess, and she was serving life in prison. I can't prove it, though, because the image is really blurry, but I think that that's her. Notice also how they're walking with their arms. There are a couple rules with women inmates that a lot of people don't know. One is the silence rule. They weren't allowed to communicate with one another in public. If they did, then they sent them to solitary confinement, and the sentences were usually a number of hours standing in solitary confinement. So I've looked at these old prison records. There's a 17-year-old that I came across her record, and she must have had a hard time with the silence rule. Very garrulous, 16-year-old, right? 17-year-old, 6 hours standing in solitary, 4 hours standing in solitary, 8 hours standing in solitary, just for simply talking. The other one is this, to walk like this. Okay, I've seen other women's prisons in photographs where they're walking like this. I'm not quite sure why. I think it might have something to do with the fact that they wanted them to keep their hands to themselves, but I don't know for sure. The other thing that's kind of fascinating here is the Detroit House of Corrections at the time was the only prison that I'm aware of in the United States that did not practice racial segregation. Our prisoners are integrated. Michigan is very progressive this way. So you can see black and white inmates standing shoulder to shoulder. The one fourth from the right doesn't want to be photographed, but she doesn't have much choice. So she is giving this naughty gesture to the cameraman. Do you see? Kind of priceless. I mean, she can't yell at him because she'll get 8 hours standing in solitary confinement. She can't not get photographed. She'll get 4 hours standing in solitary confinement. So she's doing her, her silent rebellion. This is a great photograph. Never seen a picture of this. Only sketches, because they could not capture movement with the cameras of the time. This is the women working off the at-hard labor portion of their sentence. In this particular instance, the industry they're working on is carding buttons. They didn't make the buttons, they sewed them onto cards so they could be sold that way. And you can see that here are the buttons, and they're sewing them onto cards. And again, you'd think, if you could eavesdrop on this, what would you think they'd be saying to one another? Telling a dirty joke maybe, dreaming about the future, rumor mongering or gossip, but in fact they're not saying anything because they can't. Oops. All right, here we go. I dug deep, and you will see a fleshed out version of this in my next upcoming book, but you'll not see this anyplace else. You wouldn't believe how hard this was to put together. I dug deep and I discovered that from the very beginning of the old Detroit House of Corrections until it ended and became the new Detroit House of Corrections in Plymouth Township, in the mid-1920s, there were a grand total of 34 women who were sentenced to life in prison. That's only 34 in that 60, 70-year period of time. It's not very many. So I put together the list. We have the name, we have the county, we have the years incarcerated, we have the disposition, paroled, died, paroled, pardon, which would be synonymous with paroled at the time, and then the crime. They're all murderers, every single one of them. But right away you can notice a pattern, I bet you, can't you? How'd they kill people? And who did they kill? Arsenic and strychnine, and usually lovers, husbands, brother-in-law. The other thing you're going to notice here too is notice the years they're in prison. Now, every single woman on this list got a life sentence. Now, that meant 20 years with the possibility of parole, except for the ones who died behind bars. How many of them did the 20? Okay? And you're going to see some really, really shocking things. This is one way in which that world is different than ours. If you have a first-degree murder sentence now, they go on what is known as the never list colloquially. They never come out. There's no time for good behavior, no time off sentences for good behavior. We don't execute people here, but we don't let them out. But that's not the case historically. 20 years with a possibility of parole. And if you look at these numbers, and this is exactly accurate, you look at these numbers, you're going to see that there are a few that went really long, but by and large, most of them didn't go very long at all. Here we have Ellen Bemis, who's a really good example of this. Murdered his son-in-law with strychnine, and that her sentence was cut short after 4.5 years. Okay? It's just not very long. Then on the other hand, you have Nellie Pope, who went 31 years. Now, I'm going to just introduce you to a couple of these characters because I'll go through all of them. We'll be here all night long. Rosa Schweistal, one of my favorite characters on this entire list. Rosa Schweistal was living with her brother in a house on Woodward Avenue. She was an older woman, and she caught the eye of an older immigrant by the name of Nicholas Schweistal, who must have been pretty enamored because he kept asking her to marry him and she kept putting him off. I don't know, playing hard to get. Finally, on a Sunday, she says she will. And they agree to say their I do's on the following Sabbath. That Thursday, her brother dies. Not to be deterred, Rosa walks down the aisle and says, I do, becoming Mrs. Rosa Schweistal. After the vows, Nicholas heard a rumor that the brother wasn't the brother, but he was hubby number one. Right? Police go to investigate and they find a significant amount of arsenic. They arrest her. They bring in the matron and they interrogate her, and it turns out, and she completely confesses to the whole thing. Okay? Without fanfare, without making anything up, without denying it. She says, I did it. The reason she gave is because he spent all of their money drinking, he basically drank up their paycheck in lager. So he was an alcoholic or a heavy drinker. Now, Rosa is far from a villainous character, though. She goes to the House of Corrections, and they actually call her the mother of the house. She's much older than the other inmates, and she plays kind of a matronly, motherly role for them. She is such a beloved character that she dies on Christmas Day. The warden has a funeral for her right there in the cell block. It's really interesting. Now, I'm going to pause here for a minute. You're going to notice a lot of this, arsenic and strychnine. arsenic and strychnine. Rosa Schweistel lived in a world where her husband could have beat her with a stick as long as it wasn't too thick, right? So it's real hard for me personally to condemn her, because I wonder whether she wasn't married to a guy who was a mean drunk. There's something about that confession, I killed him because he drank too much beer. I think in reality, he probably drank too much beer and came home and got the stick or beat her up, right? Or maybe he was a sadist and he liked to hit her. What's she to do? Now I know what you're thinking. It's a lot simpler and a lot less messy to just go to divorce court, right? Yeah, there is that. But I read someplace that even though a divorce was unattainable to a woman in this age, if a woman got divorced, she would have been considered a pariah in her community. They would have looked at her like, why can't you hold on to a man? What's wrong with you? And so there's at least a few women on this list that committed what I call a chemical divorce, okay, through arsenic and strychnine. It doesn't justify it, but it does explain it. Now, that is not to say that you don't have someone on this list who, wanted to kill their husband to make, to flatten out a love triangle, to make way for husband number two, or to cash in on a life insurance policy. These things are all in play. But there's at least some of them who are really trying to get themselves out of some really nasty domestic situations. And that is an important point, I think, because if a woman facing an all-male jury could convince the men that she had no other choice but to poison a rather large rat in her life, then that would explain why she might not have gotten a life sentence. This is only the lifers. I can't tell you how many people are doing second-degree murder sentences, which is much less, right? Because they were able to convince the jury that they had no other choice. And if Corin Larson did 2 years for murdering a handyman with strychnine, and that's a life sentence? Can you imagine what a second-degree sentence might be? Wow. Amanda Simmons, Allegan. She committed what a lot of people thought was the worst crime in Allegan County history when she led her 3 stepchildren down to the Kalamazoo River, drowned them, and laid them out in a row. She almost got lynched for this. A horrible crime. Now, this is an important case for a couple of different reasons, I think. One is, this might sound eerily familiar to you because there are patterns that repeat in crime. Wasn't there a woman not long ago, within the last 10 years or so, who drowned her kids by driving them into a lake or a river? Right? Okay. Now, I would argue that somebody who does that is probably mentally unbalanced in some way, shape, or form. And we have all kinds of abnormal psychology to describe situations like this, depression and so on and so forth. If you went to the sheriff who arrested Amanda Simmons and he said, "Sheriff, go easy on her because she's in a deep depression," he's going to look around in the hole she's standing in, because they wouldn't have understood criminal psychology like we do today. The depression would be literal for him. And so when you apply 21st century psychology to an old case like this, it's the ultimate example of Monday morning quarterbacking, but it's kind of fun. This is one of only 2 female arsonists I've ever heard of before. And she torched the building in Grand Rapids. Didn't kill anybody. But, she did. She killed somebody. There was somebody inside, that's right. Only got 5 years for this. I misspoke. Yeah, there was somebody in that building when she burned it up. Okay, so, oops. I'm on camera right now, and so I probably shouldn't tell you that I've got a bit of a crush on her, just in case my wife might watch this thing. But she's 6'4" and considered a statuesque beauty of her time. Her name is Nellie Pope. She was married to she was like late 20s in this photograph. She was married to a much older dentist named Horace Pope. They lived in downtown Detroit, where the dentist did his drilling in the front parlor of their house. Now, when he was busy drilling, she had taken up 2 very bad habits. One was a love for opium-based products. Called people like that opium eaters. So things like laudanum and paregoric and tincture of opium, those type of things. And you could get over the counter, you could get heroin and cocaine too. The other bad habit she picked up was an illicit affair with a young barber named Billy Brousseau, who shared her love of opium products. Now, she was able to coax her older husband into allowing Billy, the lover, to move in with them on the guys that she needed help around the house. You can imagine what that was like. Well, the dentist wound up spending his nights in the chair in the kitchen. Now, she sent Billy around town to get their dope. And she went around town and she took out increasingly larger life insurance policies in the good dentist's name. Now you know what's coming next, right? On literally a dark and rainy night, she lures the husband into a bedroom. Billy's behind the door. He comes and he whups him in the back of the head with an axe. He hits him so hard he scalps him. Then Billy takes the axe and sets it against the wall. And he goes to find an officer, and that was part of the plan. They always make one critical error in judgment, and it was leaving the axe there. They go and they get a constable, and they tell the constable, this is all the story that this was Nellie Productions, okay? And Nellie's script for Billy was, find an officer and tell him that my husband caught you with me, and he took a shot at you. You were cutting wood at the time, and you had no choice but to defend yourself and hit him in the front with an axe. Investigators come and they find the axe. And what do they find on the axe blade? They find hair and blood. Well, the dentist only had hair in the back of his head, like a half moon. Well, that was all the evidence they needed to know that he didn't hit the dentist in the front of the head. He hit him in the back of the head. So they take him off and they sweat out a confession. And he's pretty much high all the time. And they do something that officers would never do today. You talk about how times change. They tell him if he tells them the truth, they'll give him his drugs. And so he does. And he basically throws Nellie under the carriage and says that she basically concocted the entire plan. She was in the room and she directed the action like a film director would direct. He turned state's evidence and they both got life sentences. Nellie had a child at the time, a young girl named Bernice. And as the story goes, Nellie taught Bernice how to cry on cue. Now you know why, right? During a particularly damning piece of evidence, she'd have Bernice cry a little bit to try to yank on the heartstrings of the all-male jury, which didn't work. They put her in prison for life, which wound up being 31 years. Now, she was a real hellion behind bars, refused to follow the silence rule, lots of stints in solitary, beat up the other inmates. What she did fun, saw ghosts. There's one really funny exchange I read where she went to the superintendent, the warden, and complained about seeing ghosts. And his response was, if I've done what you've done, I'd see ghosts too. Here's page 2 of the list. And you're going to see a lot more of the same, right? Lots of arsenic and strychnine. Oops. And lots of people who didn't do their full 20 years. I'll introduce you to Martha Steele, who was married a guy who had a daughter from a previous relationship. And she was jealous of her husband's attention to that daughter. So she took the daughter of Angelina, she pulled out her tongue, she dumped hydrochloric acid down her throat, and then she choked her to death. Life sentence with the possibility of parole, and that let her out after what? 12 years for what I just described? Look at Inez Johnson, enabled a gang rape and a murder of a young teenager, 8 years. Now only got 20. All 20 years with the possibility of parole. But some of them got out in some really absurdly short sentences. And then of course you have Mary Frances Dewey, who murdered his stepson. She did a lot of time behind bars. She beat him up. And the court discovered that she had a habit of doing this with foster children. One kid well, it's not funny, one kid she put out, she slapped him around and then put him out in the middle of the winter, January, without any clothes. He wound up wandering over into a neighbor's house, and they to try to warm him up, they put his feet in a stove. All of this killed the kid, right? So it came back to her, and she went to prison for a really long time. Sarah Quinby, 17 years, was involved in a loveless marriage to a farmer, and I tend to think maybe an abusive farmer. And she concocted a murder-suicide. She took wine and she spiked it with morphine and fed it to her 2 children. They both died. She attempted to take an overdose herself. She didn't die. So she went to prison for life. But again, 17 years and she was paroled. I think that what you're seeing here is a little bit of a change in how our legal system deals with lifers. I think today people get life without the possibility of parole. The system is more or less saying that they're dangerous, whatever's wrong can't be fixed, or they can't ever go on the street again. I think what you're seeing here is a different vibe. They're essentially saying that after 17 years, she doesn't pose a problem to anybody anymore, and so they're going to let her out, right? I wonder about recidivism with some of these cases, whether how many of them return to crime. That would be an interesting story for future research, one that I don't have a lot of knowledge about. Here she is, the one that got me started on this whole thing, Mary Murphy McKnight, a serial poisoner and known as the Michigan Borgia. Now Mary, it's going to sound like a funny nursery rhyme, but everywhere that Mary went, she left bodies in her wake. There were all 5 of her own children. There were 2 husbands. Her first husband died after she served him a meal. Then she moved in with a friend of the family and his wife. She made the meals for them. That was part of the agreement for staying there. Well, the guy's wife gets sick and dies almost immediately. Then she marries the guy, McKnight, the artist. Then he gets sick and dies after she feeds him rhubarb pie. Right? Then there was a little Dorothy Jensen, who she was babysitting, who she spiked with strychnine. There's 19-year-old Sarah Murphy, her own sister, who she died after she fed her a spiked cup of tea. And then we come to the spring of 1903, where she is living in Springfield Township by Fife Lake, along with her mother, who's widowed, her adult brother John, his wife Gertrude, and their daughter Ruth, their baby Ruth. Now John, Gertrude, and Ruth were only living in that farmhouse, the family farmhouse, until they could build their own. When the weather broke in April, they went to work on their farmhouse, and they left baby Ruth in the tender, loving care of dear Aunt Mary. They come back for lunch, and Mary has to break the news that Ruth has died in the upstairs bed of crib death, which is what we call SIDS today. You can imagine the range of emotions that Gertrude would go through. John left her in the tender, loving care of her sister-in-law, Mary, when he went to Fife Lake to get a coffin. The death records say 1 hour has elapsed. John comes back, and Mary breaks the news that his wife has died in the same bed as their daughter, some type of seizure event. 10 days later, John Murphy experiences crippling stomach pain after eating a meal served up to him by his dear sister Mary. And you guessed it, he goes up to try to sleep it off in the same upstairs bed where he lost his wife and his daughter. Now, his mother, a very deeply religious individual, is afraid there's a biblical curse on the family, and she doesn't exactly know what to do. She runs for help, and she goes to a nearby farmhouse, which was run by a friend of John's, a guy named Battenfield. Battenfield races in the dead of night, no pun intended, to the Murphy farmhouse. He goes up to the second-story bedroom, and he's there just in time to see the last few seconds in his friend's life. And he sees something really weird. John Murphy's backbone is in a wishbone, so severe that his head is on the bed and his feet are on the floor. You can pass your arm underneath him. Okay? And then he dies. Now, what I've just described to you is a telltale sign of a strychnine overdose. When the heavy metal poison overwhelms the brainstem down in the base of your brain, the central nervous system malfunctions. And the outward manifestation of that is that wishboning. Poisoners who want to get away with it, who use strychnine, cannot afford to have a witness, because once that's witnessed, it's a giveaway. And that's what happened with Mary. All these people she poisoned, she used strychnine. The only one that was witnessed was John Murphy. And as soon as Battenfield saw what he saw, an investigation started, and they arrested her. And she confessed to murdering all 3 of them, although she kept saying over and over and over again, I didn't mean to hurt them. Make of that what you will. If you'd like to do a little dark tourism, you can head up to the Springfield Township Cemetery, and you'll see 4 of her victims all in a row. 19-year-old sister, Sarah. There's John Murphy. There's his wife, Gertrude, and in Gertrude's arms is her baby, which was very common at the time for a mother and a baby to be buried together but it was also common at the time not to put the infant's name on the headstone. I don't know why that's the case, but she's there. I checked the sexton's records. This is a twofer. You hear about cemeteries sometimes having dark secrets. This one actually does. She's in their mother's arms. Now, every great now and again, when I write about an old case like this, I will come in contact with a relative. And it turns out that I've become friends with a lineal descendant of Mary McKnight, very interested in her family's lineage. And she was a great help to me in putting together this family tree. And when I was writing the book, she was going through her family papers and she discovered the Undertaker's Bill. And this is the most fascinating thing. This is the Undertaker's Bill for all three of the Murphys that she killed. She knocked off an entire branch. She lopped off an entire branch of her family tree with strychnine. And this is the Undertaker's Bill for all three of them because they died in close proximity. It's also interesting in a small town, the Undertaker also happens to be the grocer in the feed store, pharmaceuticals. Okay, now I'm going to skip this one real quick. Look at those eyes. Ooh. She's a sociopath. They wouldn't have called her that. They would have called, the name for a sociopath in that age would have been a moral idiot, I think is the term they would have used. Kind of an old-timey term. It amounts to the same thing. I think you're looking at a sociopath. Now, what she did is she defaulted on a mortgage. And one of her creditors threw her out of the house and locked the doors. So she vowed to get even. She stalked his neighborhood until she could get his son alone. Little 6-year-old Max Ernest came out on his tricycle and she nabbed him. She took him to a swamp, stuffed his mouth full of leaves, and stomped on his head with a high-heeled shoe. When they found the body, they found these circles on his forehead. They didn't know what that was exactly. And then she choked him to death. Now, she's actually an interesting character. She was actually found guilty of the same crime twice. The first time she was found guilty, the sentence was vacated because the alienists in the audience, the psychologists, deemed that she was insane. So they sent her to the state hospital in Livonia until they deemed her sane again to stand trial. And she stood trial for the same crime and was convicted a second time. She was in the new Detroit House of Corrections in Plymouth Township. Supposedly she was very fond of the gardening. She died there in 1940. There's her getting arrested. Here's the rest of the list. And at the bottom, I pose a question to you, but I already went over this already. Why are 10 out of these 34 cases chemical divorces? Well, part of the reason is because of the easy availability, access of strychnine and arsenic. But part of it is because of the way divorce laws at the time and because of some of these situations are inevitably abuse. My favorite on this list is Ethel Walker, who committed what you might call the ultimate Motown crime when she shot a friend over a record collection. Okay, and a taste of music. Ethel's also unique on this list. Not unique, she and just one other committed crimes with firearms. There's one blunt force trauma. I don't believe there are any with bladed weapons. So a vast majority of these 34 are all arsenic and strychnine, which is kind of interesting. Here's what she looked like. Euphemia Mondich. Something about the eyes. This was known as the murder cottage. More of a serial wife, really. The Detroit newspaper said that she was married 18 times. That, of course, was typical exaggeration. She was married like 5 or 6 times. But she had a husband by the name of Mondich, and she took a lover by the name of Yodorovich, who bumped off Mondich. Then Yodorovich disappeared. When she became a person of interest, they arrested her, and rather than denying it, she led them to this place right here where they said if they crawled underneath the crawl space, they would find his remains. Now, a police officer, she sat in the backseat of the car. A police officer went down there, cupped his hands together, started shoveling dirt away, and then he found some bones. Now, she had said that Yodorovich tried to rape her, and what she did is she defended herself by shooting him. But that didn't explain the lead pipe they found next to the skull or the skull fracture in the back of the head. So they took the skull in a hat box, and they went to interrogate her, and they took it out of the hat box, and they faced it so the eye orbits were looking at her. This is perfect Halloween story. The eye orbits looking at her, tried to get her to crack, but they couldn't get her to crack. They did the same thing in trial. It's not uncommon for them to take body parts and put it on the evidence tables. They took the skull out, tried to get her to crack, but she wouldn't. And she was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Yodorovich. My favorite part of the story is husbands number 3 and 4 came to say goodbye to her, but she was now a lifer, so they couldn't touch her, they couldn't hug her, so they gently shook her hand. Then outside of the court, they shook each other's hand for having survived her. Great story. Now, I was curious as to why we have so much arsenic and strychnine in our state's history. And I was curious as to why Mary would use strychnine when it's obvious, and she could have used so many other things. I wanted to see what else that she could have found. So I went and I got some drug labels. These come from a Kalkaska pharmacy where Mary most likely bought her stuff from. And the year is about 1900. And she could have used any one of these substances. Notice the skull and crossbones? Carbolic acid, used to clean out wounds. Incredibly lethal stuff. I'll tell you a funny story. I don't mean funny, haha, like ironic, okay? I give presentations like this all over the state. And I meet some really interesting people. And I was giving a presentation, and an older couple was there, and they contacted me the next day. They were like a lot of older couples. They were downsizing, and they were going to move to Grand Rapids, where I'm from. And they had been going through a relative's things, and they found some drug bottles. And they had listened to this presentation, and they said, well, would I like to have them? And I thought, yeah, she said you could use them for, your visual aids. And I thought, okay, it'd be really cool. So I met them at a Starbucks, had a nice cup of tea, and I gave her some signed copies of my books. And she handed me this garbage bag. And I'm not gonna lie, I was getting kind of excited, right? I was hoping the labels would still be on the bottles, because a lot of times those bottles, the labels get worn off, I opened up the garbage bag, and to my utter shock and amazement, not only did they have labels on them, they were never opened. And one of them was carbolic acid. Interestingly enough, 2 of the other bottles contained charcoal tablets, which is what they would have given if somebody had an overdose. And so I think it must have come from a doctor or a pharmacist. So there, my friends, I've just admitted to doing a drug deal at Starbucks. Rather excited about, rather proud of that. Okay, so chloroform with alcohol. Notice the skull and crossbones. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why they'd even want this stuff. And then I researched it, and it turns out they gave themselves chloroform when they couldn't sleep at night. And then we have this one. This is the kind of thing that caught Nellie Pope in trouble. Paregoric. Notice the ingredients. Alcohol, 46.5%, and opium, 1.9 grains. And dose, 3 months old, 5 drops. 1 year old, 15 drops. Adults get the full teaspoonful. Okay? And you notice the skull and crossbones. This would be a lot simpler to kill somebody. Just douse them with it. Narcotic would cause the pupils to dilate. If a person died with their eyes closed, I don't know that you would even see it, right? So why would not Mary McKnight or anybody else turn to this instead of something like strychnine? And then I learned a little bit about Mary, and I learned that strychnine in this age was used as that age's version of Valium. So it was an anti-anxiety medication in small dosages, and she made her own pills. So she had access to strychnine, beyond which Michigan women, all Michiganders would have had access to arsenic and strychnine anytime they wanted, because Michigan was a farming state. And farmers used these heavy metal poisons as rodenticides to kill the rats in the granary. Just turns out that some women use them for rather large rats. Now, if and I don't see anybody taking notes here, so that's probably a good thing. If a poisoner wanted to get away with it, they'd use arsenic. Because arsenic, its outward manifestation would be the same thing as a flu, a typhus, any number of things that would have killed somebody at the time. And it had it done right, okay? A little bit at a time, and it would be bitter. And if there was too much of it, it would form a little distillate at the top of the, floating on the little floaters. So usually what poisoners of old did is they mixed the stuff into thick liquids or dark liquids. Coffee is prototypical, because if it makes the coffee slightly bitter tasting, well, you could just say that's because I made it too strong, right? And it's dark fluid. Sometimes I put it in pudding and eggnog. And so you take Rosa Schweistal, right? So she said that she was going to marry Nicholas Schweistal. She agreed to it on Sunday. Her brother died on Thursday. You wouldn't give him the whole slug all at once because that would be suspicious. So what she must have done is started dosing his food almost immediately, right? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. By Thursday, he had built up an amount in his system that overwhelmed his system. It overwhelmed his brainstem and killed him. But for anybody looking, it would look like he died of the flu. He'd have fever, chills, vomiting, nausea. It could have been any number of things. So smart killers in the past, smart poisoners, would use arsenic, not strychnine. Okay, I think I am plumb out of time. So I'm going to skip a little bit forward on this, and I'm going to go to this story. I love the story. It's kind of humorous, and that seems like the way we want to go after all this heavy stuff. So I'll tell you this one, okay? You are looking at a wedding photograph. The tall drink of water is a farmer by the name of Ney Ford, N-E-Y, Plymouth Township, where the new Detroit House of Corrections was built. She is a cabaret dancer from Toledo by the name of May Blen. They met in 1922 the way a lot of older couples met in that day, and that was through what is known as a Cupid Club, AKA a Lonely Hearts Club. The popularity of these clubs after Prohibition exploded because when alcohol was made illegal, a lot of the social clubs closed down. People went to speakeasies, it's true, but they also turned to other methods for dating, and they turned to things like Cupid Clubs. They would be given addresses of people, and then they would be up to them to make contact. There were no referees in this. There were no oversight, no safety checks. It was kind of a free-for-all. Now, Ney establishes contact with May Blen, and he goes down to see her in the flesh, so to speak, and he must be really enamored with her because he's willing to tell her a little white lie to get her to marry him. And she tells him that if she marries him, she'll never have to work another day in her life because he's a Ford, right? But he neglected to say that he wasn't that Ford family. There's a lot of Fords in Southeast Michigan. They're not all related to the auto empire. And she had a little bit of gold digger in her. So she said, I do. Boy, was she surprised when that was her palatial farmhouse. And she was made to cook the meals for the staff. She wanted to live, she wanted to go to the speakeasies and wear her miniskirts, drink cocktails, and dance to Charleston. She didn't want to be a farmer's wife. And boy, was she heated. Was she mad. So she met downtown Detroit. She met with a hitman by the name of Kansas City Ed. She slid the wedding photograph across the table and pointed out Ed's mark. She gave a map of his milking barn, and she told him that Ed was deaf in one ear, and that if he tiptoed behind Ney, she told Ed that Ney was deaf in one ear, and if she tiptoed behind him, he could brain him with something hard, and he wouldn't even know it hit him, wouldn't hear it coming. Then she wanted him to pull out all his teeth with the pliers, and then burn up the barn. Perfect plan. Talk about angst. The only problem for her is that Kansas City Ed was in fact Detective Ed Kunath of the Detroit Murder Squad. You see, drunks and babies tell the truth. And she was so proud of her plan that she was out drinking one night and she blabbed. And somehow word got back to Ney. Ney got a hold of the police, and Kunath set up this little sting. He had peeled away some of the lathing, and he had two officers behind it and overheard the whole thing. She couldn't say she didn't say it. So, Detective Kunath asks for money on the spot, Kansas City Ed, and she doesn't have it. So they agree to meet on the street the next day, and she doesn't have it. He gets impatient, and he arrests her, and that is his undoing. She gets a lawyer. Now she's in trouble for conspiracy to commit murder. And she gets a lawyer, and it's an all-male jury in 1922. And the lawyer is able to convince the 12 men that merely talking about it is not conspiracy to commit murder, or a lot of women would be in jail. And that must have been a winner with the jury because they acquitted her. Now, what really the technical legalese, the legalese of all this is, that she did not commit what is known as an overt act. An overt act would have been if she paid him. And Kunath must have known this because he asked for payment on the spot and she didn't have it. And they agreed to meet the next day to exchange payment, and she didn't have it then either. Either she didn't want to pay him, or she was that short-sighted or flighty, or she smelled something up. Take your pick. But she beat the rap. There she is, leaving court with her turban on. And she subsequently snapped and spent the rest of her days in an insane asylum in Indianapolis. So she didn't entirely get away with it, but she did get away with it. All right. This woman here would have to be on the list of Michigan's most dangerous women, although she wasn't from Michigan. She was from a small town in Florida. These two here are the infamous Lonely Hearts Killers, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck. They were lovers, and they were a killing team. What they did is they met Lonely Hearts through Lonely Heart advertisements, defrauded of their money, and then move on to the next one. She told him that she would play the role of his sister to put the marks at their ease. But she told him that she would not share him with another woman. So as the story goes, when he got amorous, she got felonious. In 1948, in December, she got felonious with a ball-peen hammer in New York as a 66-year-old widow. They had buried the widow under concrete in a basement of a rented house, and they came to Grand Rapids, where their next mark was a 28-year-old widow who had a year-and-a-half toddler, daughter named Renelle. Both the mother and the daughter disappeared. The police caught them at the crime scene with the bodies in the basement. The 28-year-old widow was buried under the concrete the same way they disposed of the remains of the New York woman. Now, this is interesting because usually when a person is caught for a crime, they're punished in that place for that crime. They were caught for a double homicide in Michigan. They would be tried and convicted and sentenced to life in prison for those Michigan crimes. But because of a strange thing that was going on in Michigan at the time and kind of a strange set of circumstances, they weren't even tried in Michigan. They were extradited to New York, where they stood trial for the murder of the 66-year-old widow, where they were sentenced to die in the electric chair. They both took the long walk in 1951. The book that I wrote about this is really it's about the whole case, but it's really, I wanted to really talk about the Michigan crimes because it's something that just really kind of got swept under the carpet, because when they were tried in New York, the prosecutor wasn't really allowed to bring up crimes in other states. So the Michigan crimes kind of are technically without closure, legal closure, but it's kind of an interesting story. The press absolutely loved to hammer her for her weight. She's a big woman, not as big as you would expect if you read all the articles. But they would do things like in her, when she went to the chair, they said that for her last meal, she ordered 2 whole fried chickens, right? And I got the I've got the file from Sing Sing, and there's her handwritten final meal on it. And it's like, it's not 2 whole fried chickens. It's fried chicken, no legs, and a salad. Well, that just gives you an idea how the press tended to kind of amplify things. She was the woman that the press loved to hate. And the reason for that is she said that he killed the 28-year-old widow, but she took the little girl down to the basement and drowned her in a bathtub. All right? And so in 1949, that was considered the ultimate betrayal for a woman whose responsibility was expected to take care of children, not to take their lives. And so when she confessed to this, the press absolutely had at her. Now, when it comes to a serial killing team like this, usually there's one dominant and one passive. it's all the evidence of my research indicates that Fernandez was the dominant, to the point where he was giving her orders to do things, right? But because of the killing of the child, she was seen as the dominant. Very, very interesting story. Weird story. When they got up and they testified in their own defense, they wanted to try to convince the jury that Martha was suffering from a sexual type of insanity. And so what they did is they pulled the covers back on their own relationship in what was considered to be testimony that was so perverse the newspapers wouldn't print it. So naturally, I got a hold of the trial transcripts because I was kind of curious to see what it was that the papers wouldn't print, right? And I did. I saw. Wouldn't be as shocking as you think. But if you want to find out, it's in that book right there. All right. All right. My last two publications and then I've got these three coming out. This one I have a couple of copies. This one I do not. This one I'm very proud of. It's not a Michigan case, but as far as I know, I'm the only guy who's ever written a biography of an executioner. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe I'm the sociopath in the group here. Anyways, Amos Lunt was the first hangman of San Quentin. And he hanged 20 of the wildest bandits in the Wild West. And then they started to visit him in his nightmares. And then they started to visit him during the daytime. Lots of stories of Amos pointing a weapon at nobody, right? He wound up in an institute in Napa County where he died in 1901. Now, it's not an easy thing hanging somebody. I'll spare you the details, all right? But it's not easy. And there was a wave of anti-capital punishment sweeping through California because of all of these lynchings, all right? So when the state put it onto the shoulders of the prison wardens, they were under intense pressure to get it right. And if you get a hanging right, it's a pretty painless death. But it's really hard to get it right. If you get it wrong, you really get it wrong. Okay? I mean, really. And the newspapers all sent people there, and this is the height of yellow journalism, and they wrote blow by blow accounts of what happened. And if he botched it, the whole world was going to know, right? Added to which, he was the last guy to see the face of the condemned before they die. I think they carry a tremendous amount of burden with them for that. They can always justify that they were instruments of the legal system, but when it comes right down to it, they're standing within a breath of another human being who they're about to kill, right? So I got in my mind that Amos was suffering from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Here, I'll save you the trouble of buying this one, all right? So I got a list of telltale characteristics of people with PTSD. Now I was thinking of my subject Amos, and I was going through this, and yep, he checks that box, he checks that box, and he checks that box, and all of a sudden, I check that box, and I check that box, and I check that box too. And I thought to myself, where in the world would I have gotten post-traumatic stress disorder? Yeah, I was a morgue volunteer for a year. That was kind of interesting. But no, that wasn't it. Then all of a sudden it came to me, I got PTSD. It was the 10 years I spent teaching 8th graders. I said 8th grade for a decade, and I walked out with an acronym. There you go. All right. Here's my next presentation, which I'm now scheduling for 2024. If you like this type of thing, I will introduce you to these fine people and some of the stories that they did. Alice Dudgeon, her name was. Dudgeon. You know what her crime was? She bludgeoned a guy. I can't make this up. Dudgeon, bludgeon. Get it? All right, here I am behind bars of an old historic prison. I was Chloride, Arizona, actually. Old territorial jail you could kind of wander in. Actually kind of freaked out about rattlesnakes. Here's my email. If you'd like to contact me and talk about crime sometime, anytime, please feel free. I present all the time. I do about 50 or 60 of these a year. I do a lot of them down in this area. I have 4 this week. I'm going to be in Howell tomorrow. And then I have a couple next week, and then I'm off for a little bit. And then I'll start back in with 2024. So if you like this kind of thing and you want to take a walk on the dark side, check out my schedule because I might be coming to a library near you. Now, having said that, positive word of mouth is my very best advertisement. So if you enjoyed the presentation this evening, talk to my friends at Livonia here about possibly having me back. I'm going to offer a couple of new presentations in the new year. Talk to other libraries who might like to host me. I'm kind of a cheap date. If you didn't like what you hear, don't say anything to anybody. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I did stay 15 minutes past my time, but that's not too bad. I got my mama's gift of gab. So, with apologies for keeping you 15 minutes longer, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions you might have for me. And then, yeah, go for it. Any other questions or comments? I hope you enjoyed the presentation this evening. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Thank you.